The heavy oak front door clicked shut, and the sudden silence in the house was deafening. I stood in the center of the gleaming kitchen, a damp microfiber cloth clutched in my aching hand, and listened to the muffled sound of Chloe's laughter fading as she and Bradley walked their last guests out to the driveway. It was a Tuesday night. A Tuesday. But in my son's house, any night was a good night to showcase their immaculate lives. The countertops, a sprawling expanse of cold, white Calicotta marble, were littered with the remnants of their perfection. Half-empty crystal wine glasses bearing the dark red stains of imported Merlot, smeary porcelain plates that had held artisanal cheese and figs, and the lingering, heavy scent of Chloe's expensive floral perfume mixed with roasted garlic. I am 62 years old. My name is Eleanor. I used to be an accountant, a woman who understood the absolute truth of numbers, a woman who built a warm, loud, lived-in home in Ohio with a husband who adored her. Now, I am a ghost, a quiet, diligent phantom who haunts the edges of my son's picturesque suburban New York life, cleaning up the messes they leave behind. I walked over to the oversized stainless steel sink and began rinsing the delicate plates. The water was hot, biting into the dry skin of my knuckles, but I welcomed the sensation. It grounded me. Upstairs in the pristine, neutral-toned rooms that looked more like a museum exhibition than a family home, my 2 grandchildren were already asleep. They were the reason I was here. Or at least they were the reason I had convinced myself to stay. "You'll never be alone, Mom," Bradley had promised me 2 years ago, standing in the driveway of the Ohio house just days after we buried his father. The wind had been biting that day, and he had wrapped his heavy wool coat around my shoulders. He looked so much like his dad in that moment, tall, broad-shouldered, with those earnest brown eyes. "Sell this big empty place. Move in with us. We're buying a new house in Westchester. The kids need their grandmother, and Chloe and I want you there. We'll build a life together." I wanted to believe him. The grief was so fresh, so entirely suffocating, that the thought of waking up alone in that house, walking past my husband's empty armchair, felt like a physical death sentence. So I agreed. I packed up 35 years of memories, sold the house we had built with our own hands, and wired Bradley $150,000. It was 40% of the down payment for this sprawling modern monstrosity. "It's an investment, Mom," he had said, clapping me on the shoulder when the wire transfer cleared. "This is your home as much as it is ours." I finished loading the dishwasher, wiping down the control panel so there wouldn't be a single fingerprint left to offend Chloe's aesthetic sensibilities in the morning. I turned off the pendant lights, plunging the kitchen into shadows, and began the familiar quiet walk to my room. Not a guest room upstairs with a view of the garden, not the sunny bedroom at the end of the hall. My room was in the basement. When I first arrived, Bradley had looked sheepish. "Mom, I am so sorry. Chloe really needs the spare bedroom upstairs for her vlog studio. You know how important her channel is to her right now. It's just temporary until we finish the attic." 2 years later, the attic was still untouched fiberglass insulation, and I was still descending the narrow, creaky stairs into the damp, windowless lower level. The air down here always felt heavy, smelling faintly of concrete and laundry detergent from the adjacent utility room. My entire world was condensed into a space slightly larger than a walk-in closet. I had a bed, a single dresser, and a small lamp that cast a weak yellow pool of light against the gray drywall. It was a stark reminder of the fragile family ties I had sacrificed everything to maintain. I sat on the edge of the mattress, my knees popping in the quiet room. My back ached with a dull, persistent throb. I reached into my bedside table and pulled out a small bottle of ibuprofen, swallowing 2 pills dry. Above me, the floorboards creaked. Bradley and Chloe were back inside. Their voices drifted down through the air vents. I never meant to eavesdrop. As a mother, you learn early on to tune out the background noise of your children's lives. But in this house, the vents carried their words down to my basement room with perfect, cruel clarity. "Did you see the look on Sarah's face when she saw the new dining set?" Chloe's voice was bright, vibrating with satisfaction. "I told her it was custom made in Italy." She was practically green. "It looks great, babe," Bradley replied, though his voice sounded tight, exhausted. "But we need to cool it for a while. That dinner tonight cost us almost $600, and the credit card bill—" "Oh, stop," Chloe interrupted, the sweetness instantly vanishing, replaced by a sharp edge. "We had to host. It's about networking, Brad. You want that promotion, don't you? We have to look the part. Besides, your mother didn't even come up to say hello. She just hovered in the kitchen like the help. It's embarrassing. My chest tightened. I squeezed my eyes shut, my hands curling into fists on my lap. Like the help. I had stayed in the kitchen because earlier that afternoon, Chloe had specifically asked me not to crowd the living room while she was entertaining her influencer friends. She had told me my cardigan didn't match the vibe of the evening. "She's just trying to stay out of your way, Chloe," Bradley sighed. It was a weak defense, the tone of a man who had long ago given up fighting. "Anyway, the mortgage rate just adjusted, and the kids' tuition for the fall is due next month. I don't know where we're going to pull the extra $3,000 from." There was a pause. I held my breath, the quiet family pain settling deep into my bones. "Just ask her," Chloe said. Her voice was flat, devoid of any hesitation. "She has her pension. And what else does she spend money on down there in her little cave? Nothing. Tell her the kids need it. She never says no when it comes to the kids." "I can't keep doing that, Chloe. I already asked her to cover the groceries and the utility bill last week." "Brad, she lives here rent-free. It's the least she can do. Rent-free." The words echoed in the small, damp room. $150,000. That was what I had paid for the privilege of becoming an invisible maid in a basement. I lay back on the thin mattress, staring up at the ceiling tiles, a cold, hard knot forming in my stomach. The ache in my back was suddenly dwarfed by the hollow ache in my chest. The next morning, the house was a flurry of chaotic energy. I was up at 6, brewing the expensive artisan coffee Bradley liked and packing the kids' organic lunches. By the time Bradley came downstairs, adjusting his silk tie, the kitchen was spotless again. He poured himself a mug of coffee, leaning heavily against the island. He looked tired. The dark circles under his eyes were prominent, and the sharp, confident posture he usually carried had slumped. "Morning, Mom," he mumbled, taking a sip. "Morning, Bradley. Did you sleep well?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly even, wiping down a counter that was already perfectly clean. "Not really." He let out a long, theatrical sigh, rubbing his temples. "Just stressed. The economy is a mess right now. Inflation is killing us. Everything is just so expensive." I paused, the damp cloth resting against the marble. I knew the script. I had lived through this performance a dozen times in the last year. First came the sigh, then the complaint about the economy, then the reluctant admission of a specific financial shortfall, and finally, the heavy, guilty look that was designed to break a mother's heart. "The kids' school just bumped up their tuition again," he continued, not looking at me. "And with Chloe's channel needing new equipment, things are just really tight this month. I hate to even bring it up." He stopped, waiting for me to step in, waiting for me to offer. The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. I looked at my son, really looked at him. I saw the expensive tailored suit, the $300 shoes, the gleaming smartwatch on his wrist, and I thought about my damp basement room. "That sounds difficult, Bradley," I said quietly. I didn't reach for my purse. I didn't offer my credit card. He blinked, clearly thrown off rhythm. He looked up, his brow furrowed. "Yeah, it is. I don't know how I'm going to cover the grocery run this weekend. The kids need their specific snacks, and you know how Chloe gets if the fridge isn't stocked." The manipulation was so seamless, so practiced, it almost made me dizzy. He wasn't asking for himself. He was weaponizing my grandchildren. He knew I would never let the kids go without. I took a slow, deep breath, burying the sudden surge of nausea. "I can cover the groceries this weekend, Bradley," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. His posture instantly relaxed. The heavy burden seemed to magically lift from his shoulders. He smiled, that charming, easy smile that used to melt my heart. "Thanks, Mom. You're a lifesaver. Seriously, I'll pay you back as soon as my bonus clears." He wouldn't. He never did. He kissed my cheek, a quick, obligatory peck, and hurried out the door. I stood alone in the kitchen for a long time. The house was quiet again, but the silence didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt heavy with unspoken truths. Family lies exposed, hanging in the air like dust motes in the morning sunlight. Later that afternoon, after dropping the kids off at their horseback riding lessons, I realized I needed my old W-2 forms. I was applying for a new Medicare supplement plan, and the insurance broker had asked for my tax returns from the year my husband passed. Since Bradley had taken over managing our major paperwork when we sold the Ohio house, I knew the files were somewhere in his home office. Bradley's office was off limits to everyone, even Chloe. It was a dark, oak-paneled sanctuary filled with law books he never read and a massive mahogany desk. The door was usually locked, but today, in his rush to leave, he hadn't pulled it shut all the way. I pushed the door open, feeling a sudden irrational spike of guilt. "I'm just looking for my own tax forms," I reminded myself. "I'm his mother. I have a right to my own paperwork." The desk was a chaotic mess of unopened mail, spreadsheets, and sticky notes. I walked behind the heavy leather chair and opened the bottom filing cabinet. It was disorganized, a stark contrast to the meticulously curated aesthetic of the rest of the house. I flipped through folders labeled Mortgage, Insurance, Chloe's LLC. Finally, I found a thick manila folder tucked all the way in the back, labeled with my name, Eleanor, Financials. I pulled it out and set it on the desk. Inside were the W-2s I needed, my old property tax receipts from Ohio, and my Social Security documents. But beneath them was a stack of bank statements from Fidelity. I frowned, adjusting my reading glasses. It was the joint emergency retirement account. When my husband passed, he had left a modest life insurance policy. After paying off the remaining debts and moving expenses, there had been exactly $40,000 left. Bradley had insisted we put it into a joint high-yield account. "Just in case, Mom," he had said earnestly. "In case you have a medical emergency or need sudden care. I'll be a co-signer so I can handle the logistics if you're ever incapacitated. But that money is yours. Untouchable. A safety net." Being a former accountant, numbers have a way of speaking to me. They don't lie. They don't manipulate. They just sit there on the page, telling the absolute truth. I looked at the top statement. It was dated last month. My eyes skipped down past the account number, past my name printed alongside his, straight to the bottom right corner. Ending balance, $412.50. The air in the room suddenly vanished. I couldn't breathe. The numbers swam before my eyes, blurring into meaningless shapes. $412. My hands began to tremble. I dropped the paper onto the desk and grabbed the edge of the mahogany wood to steady myself. "No, it's a mistake. The bank made a mistake. He moved it to a better-yielding CD. He wouldn't." I frantically dug through the folder, pulling out the older statements, arranging them in chronological order across the desk like pieces of a horrifying puzzle. The story the numbers told was brutal and undeniable. 2 years ago, the balance was $40,000. 18 months ago, a withdrawal of $8,500. 14 months ago, a transfer of $5,000. 10 months ago, $12,000 withdrawn. My hands shook so violently I could barely turn the pages. I looked closely at the transaction codes. These weren't investments. They were direct transfers to Bradley's personal checking account. I pulled open the top drawer of his desk, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I didn't care about boundaries anymore. I was an investigator in my own tragedy. I found a stack of credit card statements and an auto lease agreement. I cross-referenced the dates. The $8,500 withdrawal coincided exactly with the down payment on the sleek black Porsche SUV parked in the garage, the car he said his company had given him as a signing bonus. The $5,000 transfer happened 3 days before Chloe started posting photos from their anniversary getaway at a 5-star ski resort in Aspen. The $12,000? That was withdrawn the same week they hired the contractors to rip out the perfectly good kitchen and install the Calicotta marble countertops I was currently cleaning every day. They hadn't just taken my money. They had used the safety net meant to keep me out of a state-run nursing home to fund their luxury aesthetic. They had stolen my future to buy matching ski outfits and Italian marble. I sat down heavily in Bradley's leather chair. The room spun. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, it felt like a physical blow to the chest. My own son, the baby I had rocked to sleep, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, the man who had stood at his father's grave and promised I would never be alone. He had looked me in the eye this morning, wearing a suit bought with my stolen security, and begged me for grocery money. I didn't cry. That was the strangest part. Women my age are supposed to weep when our hearts are broken. We are supposed to dissolve into helpless puddles of grief. But as I sat there, surrounded by the black and white proof of my son's thievery, the tears didn't come. Instead, a cold, hard clarity washed over me. The quiet, accommodating woman who had folded herself into a tiny basement room to make her son's life easier died in that chair. I carefully gathered the statements. I didn't put them back in the folder. I slipped them into my purse, making sure the desk looked exactly as I had found it. I locked the drawer, stood up, and walked out of the office, pulling the door securely shut behind me. As I walked down the hall, the house felt different. It was no longer a home I didn't belong in. It was a crime scene. And I was no longer a ghost. I was a woman who was finally waking up. I went down to my basement room, the damp air no longer feeling oppressive, but rather like a bunker. I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out my old leather-bound address book. I turned the pages until I found the letter M. Margaret Vance, an attorney, a shark in a tailored suit, and my late husband's oldest friend. I hadn't spoken to Margaret since the funeral. I hadn't wanted her to know how small my life had become. But I didn't care about pride anymore. I cared about survival. I picked up my phone and dialed the number. The voicemail I left for Margaret Vance that afternoon was brief. My voice didn't shake, though my hands still did. Margaret, it's Eleanor Hayes. I need your legal counsel. Please call me back as soon as you can. I hung up the phone and placed it carefully on my cheap plywood nightstand. I didn't cry. I simply sat in the dim yellow light of my basement room and waited for the world to stop spinning. It didn't. Instead, the world outside my windowless bunker shifted into the frantic, glittering overdrive of the holiday season. It was mid-December. Upstairs, Chloe had transformed the house into a magazine spread. She had hired a professional landscaping company to drape the exterior in thousands of cascading white lights. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of imported pine candles and the faint, constant hum of holiday jazz playing through the smart speakers. Every surface was covered in faux frost, silver ribbons, and perfectly arranged ornaments. It was a masterpiece of illusion, and I was the ghost haunting the halls of their winter wonderland. For 3 days after discovering the empty Fidelity account, I said nothing. I moved through the house with the mechanical precision of a wind-up toy. I baked the gingerbread cookies Chloe needed for her aesthetic Instagram reels. I ironed Bradley's shirts. I smiled at my grandchildren and read them stories. I watched my son pour himself expensive scotch, wearing the watch he bought with my stolen retirement money, and I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. I needed to wait for Margaret's call. I needed a plan. I had spent my entire adult life making careful, calculated choices. I wasn't going to let the blinding rage of a mother's broken heart force me into a mistake. But the universe, it seemed, was tired of my patience. It was a Tuesday evening, 3 days before Chloe's highly publicized over-the-top Christmas Eve cocktail party. The temperature outside had plummeted into the teens, and a bitter New York wind whipped against the siding of the house. I was in the laundry room, located just off the mudroom that connected to the 3-car garage. The space was narrow, smelling heavily of bleach and the lavender fabric softener Chloe insisted on using. I was folding a stack of thick, white bath towels. The dryer was running, emitting a low, rhythmic hum that usually soothed me. The heavy door leading to the mudroom was cracked open just a few inches. I heard the heavy garage door roll up, followed by the solid thud of the Porsche's doors closing. Bradley and Chloe had been out doing last-minute shopping at the high-end boutiques downtown. I reached for another hot towel, shaking it out, when their voices carried through the cracked door. They weren't talking. They were hissing at each other with the kind of venom reserved for people who are trapped. I don't even understand how it happened, Brad. Chloe's voice was a shrill, panicked whisper. The cashier looked at me like I was a criminal, declined. At Neiman Marcus. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was? Susan was standing right behind me in line. Keep your voice down, Bradley snapped, his tone sharp and panicked. The sound of heavy shopping bags hitting the slate floor echoed in the small space. I told you we were close to the limit on the platinum card. I told you to use the other one. The other one was maxed out paying for the caterer for Friday night, Chloe shot back, her voice trembling with rising hysteria. What is going on with our money? You said your bonus covered the deficit. You said you moved funds around. I froze. The warm towel in my hands suddenly felt heavy, like wet cement. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I did move funds around. Bradley's voice cracked, sounding desperately exhausted. But it wasn't enough, Chloe. The mortgage went up, the car payments, the private school tuitions. We are bleeding cash. I have been moving money from one sinking ship to another for a year. So what are we supposed to do? She demanded, completely devoid of empathy for his panic. Cancel the party? Send out an email to the entire neighborhood saying the Hayes family is officially broke? I have brand sponsorships lined up for the new year that depend on this house looking a certain way. We have an image to maintain." "Image?" Bradley let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded nothing like the boy I had raised. "I am drowning, Chloe. I haven't slept a full night in months. I am 38 years old and I am suffocating under a mountain of debt trying to keep you in Italian leather and custom drapery. Don't you dare put this on me." "I'm not putting it on you. I'm just telling you the reality. There is no more money. The emergency accounts are tapped. The credit lines are frozen. We are one missed payment away from the bank foreclosing on this damn house." The silence that followed was suffocating. I pressed my back against the vibrating metal of the washing machine, my eyes wide in the dim laundry room. They were going to lose the house. My house. The house I had poured my life savings into. He had stolen my $40,000, and it hadn't even made a dent in his catastrophic financial failures. Then, Chloe spoke again. Her voice was no longer shrill. It was frighteningly calm, cold, and calculating. "What about your mother?" "What about her?" Bradley sighed heavily. "I already squeezed her for groceries this week. She doesn't have anything left to give, Chloe. Her pension barely covers her own supplemental medical stuff." "No, Brad," Chloe said, her voice dropping lower, taking on a sickeningly practical tone. "I mean, what about her?" I stopped breathing entirely. "She has life insurance, doesn't she?" Chloe pressed. "And she owns 40% of this property. If she wasn't here, if her name wasn't on the deed, the equity alone would clear our debts, not to mention whatever payout you'd get as her beneficiary." My heart slammed against my ribs so hard it physically hurt. I waited for my son to explode. I waited for him to defend me, to tell his wife that she was crossing a line of human decency that could never be uncrossed. I waited for the boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard to tell her she was a monster. He didn't. Bradley let out a long, ragged exhale, the sound of a man completely broken by his own greed. "I know," he whispered. The words were a knife sliding cleanly between my ribs. "I've thought about it. God help me. I've thought about it every single day for the last 3 months. I don't know where else to get the money, Chloe. Unless Mom is gone, there is no way out of this hole. Honestly, the greatest Christmas gift this year would be if she just closed her eyes and didn't wake up." The washing machine rattled. The dryer hummed. "Well," Chloe said simply, unaffected by the sheer horror of the statement. "She's healthy as a horse, so unless you have a magic wand, you better figure something else out before the caterer demands the final payment on Friday." Footsteps clicked away across the hardwood. The mudroom door shut. I don't know how long I stood there. The towel slipped from my numb fingers, pooling on the linoleum floor. The air in the laundry room felt thin, devoid of oxygen. The greatest Christmas gift this year would be if she just closed her eyes and didn't wake up. My own son. The child I had carried for 9 months. The boy I had stayed awake with through fevers and nightmares. The man for whom I had sold my past and mortgaged my future. He was waiting for me to die. He was actively calculating the financial benefit of my corpse. I didn't collapse. I didn't scream. The woman who might have done those things had vanished forever. In her place was someone entirely new, someone carved from ice. I bent down, picked up the towel, folded it meticulously, and placed it on the stack. I finished the laundry. I wiped down the machines. Then I walked silently back down the stairs to my basement. The next morning, the house was tense. Chloe was locked in her studio, avoiding everyone, and Bradley left for the city before sunrise, claiming he had an early meeting. I moved through my morning routine with a terrifying detachment. I made coffee. I wiped counters. Around 11 o'clock, the mail carrier's truck pulled up to the curb. Usually, Chloe intercepted the mail, obsessively checking for her PR packages. But today, the house was quiet. I walked to the front door and pulled the stack of envelopes from the brass slot, mostly catalogs and holiday cards from people they barely knew. But halfway through the pile, a thick, pristine white envelope caught my eye. The return address was Apex Mutual Life and Casualty. It was addressed to Bradley Hayes, but right below his name in smaller print it read, "Re-insured Eleanor Hayes. Annual Policy Review." I frowned. I didn't have a policy with Apex Mutual. My life insurance, the modest policy my husband had set up decades ago, was through a small local agency back in Ohio, and the premiums were automatically deducted from my pension. My fingers felt cold as I slid my thumbnail under the flap, tearing the envelope open. I didn't care that it was addressed to him. The rules of privacy had burned to the ground the night before. I pulled out a thick stack of papers. The first page was a premium renewal notice. Policy type: accidental death and sudden cardiac event, high-risk supplement. Coverage amount: $500,000. Primary beneficiary: Bradley Hayes, son. Monthly. Premium $345. Past due. I stared at the paper. This wasn't a standard life insurance policy. It was a high-risk supplementary plan. The kind that pays out quickly, no questions asked, in the event of a sudden unexpected tragedy. A fall down the stairs. A fatal heart attack in the middle of the night. A chill violently through my body, settling deep in my marrow. I flipped to the second page. It was a photocopy of the original application, attached for the annual file review. I scanned the typed information, my name, my age, my medical history, all of it accurate. And then I looked at the bottom of the page. Signature of insured. There it was, my name, written in cursive in blue ink. But it wasn't my handwriting. The loop of the E was too sharp. The slant of the H was entirely wrong. It was a clumsy, desperate imitation of my signature. Bradley had forged my name. He hadn't just sat in the mudroom and idly wished for my death. He had actively bet against my life. A year ago, while smiling at me over the dinner table, he had taken out a $500,000 policy on my head, forging my signature to do it. He was paying $345 a month, likely using the money he stole from my emergency fund to keep the policy active. He wasn't just waiting for nature to take its course. He was financially invested in my sudden tragic demise. I stood in the grand entryway of the house I had paid for, beneath a crystal chandelier that caught the winter sunlight, holding the proof of my son's sociopathic greed. He had backed himself into a financial corner so tight, so inescapable, that the only way out he could see was over my dead body. Would he push me? Would he slip something into my coffee? Or would he just watch me have a stroke and slowly count to 100 before dialing 911? Suddenly, my basement room didn't feel like a prison anymore. It felt like a trap. I walked upstairs, my legs moving with rigid mechanical purpose. I bypassed my room and went straight into the kitchen. I grabbed a kitchen trash bag and walked into the pantry, stuffing my few personal food items into it. I wasn't going to eat anything in this house again. I went down to the basement, locked the flimsy hollow core door behind me, and shoved a heavy wooden chair under the handle. I sat on the bed, the insurance papers gripped tightly in my hand. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. The sudden noise made me jump. I looked at the screen. The caller ID flashed. Margaret Vance. I picked up the phone. My hand was perfectly steady now. The trembling had stopped entirely. Eleanor? Margaret's voice was crisp, sharp, and deeply familiar. It sounded like sanity. It sounded like the world I used to belong to before I became a victim. I got your message. What's going on? You sounded different. I looked down at the forged signature on the $500,000 death bet. I looked at the concrete walls of the basement they had exiled me to. Margaret, I said, my voice smooth, quiet, and deadly cold. My son is waiting for me to die, and he's placed a bet on it. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Margaret was a lawyer who had seen the absolute worst of human nature during her 30-year career in family law. It took a lot to shock her. "Where are you right now, Eleanor?" she asked, her voice instantly dropping into professional tactical mode. "Are you safe?" "For the moment," I replied, staring at the locked door. "But I need to move quickly. I need you to pull the original deed to this house, the one from 2 years ago." "I have a copy in my archives," Margaret said. "But Eleanor, tell me what he did." "He stole my retirement fund, and he forged my signature on a $500,000 accidental death policy. But that's not the worst part, Margaret. What could possibly be worse than that? He forgot who he was dealing with," I whispered into the receiver. "I need to make sure he loses absolutely everything before I leave this house. I want out, Margaret, but I want out on my terms. I want him to feel what it's like to be completely, utterly stripped bare." I could almost hear Margaret smiling through the phone, a predator recognizing another predator. "All right, Eleanor," she said, the click of a keyboard echoing in the background. "Let's go hunting." The next morning I left the house before the sun had even considered rising. It was barely 5:30, the air outside brittle and bitter cold. The frost on the meticulously manicured front lawn crunched under my boots as I walked down the driveway. I didn't take my car. Bradley had the keys hanging on his custom leather rack in the mudroom, and the sound of the engine starting would echo through the quiet house. Instead, I called an Uber from a block away and rode in silence to the Metro North station. Riding the train from Westchester into Manhattan at dawn is a peculiar experience. The cars are filled with people wrapped in expensive wool coats, staring blankly out the windows, holding tightly to their thermal coffee mugs. Usually, I felt out of place among them. I was just the grandmother from the basement. But today, listening to the rhythmic, hypnotic clack of the wheels on the tracks, I didn't feel old, and I certainly didn't feel invisible. I felt like a woman walking out of a burning building, finally breathing oxygen. Grand Central Station was a cathedral of marble and rushing bodies. I bypassed the bakeries and the tourists, walking briskly out onto 42nd Street. The biting wind off the East River whipped at my scarf, but my hands, tucked deep into my coat pockets, were perfectly steady. My purse held my Social Security card, my birth certificate, the bank statements proving my son's theft, and the forged life insurance policy proving his morbid, desperate greed. Margaret Vance's law office was on the 42nd floor of a sleek glass tower in Midtown. Margaret and my late husband had gone to law school together. While my husband had chosen the quiet life of a local firm in Ohio, Margaret had moved to New York and become one of the most ruthless, brilliant family law attorneys in the city. She was a woman who commanded a room simply by sitting in it. When the receptionist ushered me into her corner office, Margaret stood up. She was 62, exactly my age, but she wore it like armor. Her silver hair was cropped into a sharp architectural bob, and she wore a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my son's stolen Porsche payments. "Eleanor," she said, her voice warm, but her eyes sharp, scanning my face as she walked around her massive oak desk. She pulled me into a brief, firm hug. "Sit down. You look like you haven't slept in a week." "I haven't," I replied, taking a seat in the plush leather chair opposite her. I didn't waste time with small talk. The urgency humming in my veins wouldn't allow it. I unclasped my purse, pulled out the manila envelope, and slid it across the polished wood of her desk. "Look at the insurance policy first." Margaret put on her reading glasses. The office was dead silent as she turned the pages. I watched her perfectly manicured fingers pause over the signature page. I saw the exact moment her legal mind processed the forgery. Her jaw tightened, a subtle twitch of muscle beneath her cheekbone. "This is an accidental death and dismemberment policy, heavily weighted toward sudden cardiac events," Margaret said, her voice dropping an octave, devoid of any warmth now. "And this signature is a clumsy forgery. Eleanor, this is insurance fraud. It's a felony. We could take this straight to the district attorney." "I don't want him in jail, Margaret," I said softly, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling concrete grid of Manhattan. "If he goes to prison, my grandchildren lose their father, and Chloe will play the victim on the internet for the rest of her life. I don't want vengeance. I want justice. I want to dismantle his financial life, brick by stolen brick, until he has to look me in the eye and realize exactly whose house he burned down." Margaret slowly lowered the paper, peering at me over the rim of her glasses. A slow, deeply appreciative smile spread across her face. "I always knew you had a spine of steel under all those cardigans, Eleanor. Let's look at the property." She pulled a thick file from a stack on her desk. She had already pulled the public records for the Westchester house. "When you gave him the $150,000 for the down payment, Bradley's mortgage broker insisted on putting you on the deed to satisfy the origin of the funds. Bradley promised you it was an investment. He said we would build a life together," I corrected her, the bitter taste of the memory coating my tongue. "Well, his arrogance is going to be his ruin," Margaret said, tapping a manicured nail against the heavy parchment of the deed. "He never had you sign a quitclaim deed to remove yourself after the closing. I doubt he even remembered to do it, or maybe he didn't want to pay the filing fees. You are listed as a tenant in common, Eleanor. You own 40% of that property. So what does that mean?" "It means you have the power to force his hand," she explained, leaning forward, her eyes gleaming with tactical precision. "As a tenant in common, if you want out of the investment and the other owner refuses to buy you out, which we know Bradley cannot afford to do because he's drowning in debt, you can file a partition lawsuit. We petition the court to force the sale of the house so you can recover your equity." My breath hitched. Force the sale? They would lose the house? "Immediately," Margaret confirmed. The moment I file that lis pendens, a notice of pending litigation, it attaches to the property's title. Bradley won't be able to refinance. He won't be able to take out a home equity loan to cover his other debts. His credit lines tied to the house will freeze. It will lock him in a financial cage. The court will order the house put on the market. The mortgage will be paid off from the proceeds, and you will get your 40% straight off the top of the remaining equity. I stared at the paperwork. For 2 years, I had believed I was trapped. I had let my son relegate me to a basement, tiptoeing around his wife's aesthetic demands, begging for basic respect, all because I thought my money was gone forever. I thought I had bought a prison cell. I hadn't. I held the keys. I held the kill switch to their entire fake, glittering empire. "We draft the partition action," Margaret instructed, already making notes on a legal pad. "But before I serve him, we need to protect your immediate assets. Bradley is desperate. Desperate men do incredibly stupid things. If he thinks he's going under, he'll try to drain whatever else he can access." She gave me a list of instructions, precise and military in their execution. I left her office at 10 in the morning. By noon, I was sitting in a branch of a completely different bank, 3 towns over from Westchester. I opened a new checking account and a new high-yield savings account solely in my name. I sat in the banker's cubicle and made the phone calls to the Social Security Administration and my husband's pension fund, aggressively rerouting all my direct deposits to the new accounts, effective immediately. Next, I called the 3 major credit bureaus. I placed a hard freeze on my Social Security number. Nobody, especially not my son, would be opening any more credit cards or taking out any more fraudulent insurance policies in my name. Finally, I called my old bank, the one where Bradley had drained the $40,000. I formally removed my name from the joint account. I told the teller I suspected fraud. She froze the account entirely pending an investigation. Bradley wouldn't even be able to access the remaining $400. By 3 o'clock, I was back on the train heading north. My purse was lighter, but my soul felt anchored. The terrible, hollow ache of betrayal in my chest hadn't disappeared, but it had calcified. It had turned into armor. I walked back through the front door of the Westchester house just after 4. Chloe was in the living room, setting up a ring light for a sponsored video about holiday stress. She barely glanced at me as I walked past. She had no idea I had even left. To them, my absence was as unnoticeable as my presence. That evening, the house smelled of roasting chicken and rosemary. It was a Wednesday, a typical family dinner night, but the atmosphere was unusually thickly sweet. Bradley came home early, carrying a bouquet of grocery store tulips. He kissed Chloe, swung his youngest daughter in the air, and actually pulled out my chair for me at the dining table. It was a performance, a desperately orchestrated play, and I was the mark. I sat quietly, cutting my chicken, watching my son act like the man I thought I had raised. He asked about my day. He complimented my sweater. Chloe chimed in, offering to help me set up a new tablet so I could video call my friends in Ohio. The sudden influx of attention and affection was so transparent it was almost insulting. When the plates were cleared, Bradley cleared his throat. He reached under his chair and pulled out a small, flat box wrapped in silver paper. "Mom," he said, his voice dripping with earnest affection. He slid the box across the table. "I know we usually wait until Christmas Eve, but I saw this today and I wanted you to have it early. You do so much for us. You're the glue holding this family together." The hypocrisy of the words physically repulsed me, but my face remained an unreadable mask. I took the box. I peeled back the paper. Inside was a thin, violently purple silk scarf, the kind you buy from a kiosk near the subway station. The tag had been hastily ripped off, but the cheap fabric clung to my dry fingers. "It's lovely, Bradley. Thank you," I said, folding my hands over it. "We just want you to be happy here, Mom," he said, leaning forward, resting his elbows on the table. He exchanged a quick, loaded glance with Chloe. The trap was set. Now came the spring. "Actually, while we're all sitting here, I wanted to run something by you." "Here it comes." "The roofing contractor called today," Bradley sighed, rubbing the back of his neck, playing the part of the weary, hard-working patriarch to perfection. "Apparently, the leak over the garage is worse than we thought. If we don't fix it before the heavy snow hits in January, it could collapse the ceiling." "Oh no," I murmured. "Yeah, it's a mess," he said, shaking his head. "Insurance won't cover it. It's considered wear and tear. They need a $5,000 deposit to start the work tomorrow. I don't have it liquid right now, Mom. My bonus is tied up in escrow for another month. I was wondering, could you front us the $5,000 just from the emergency account? I'll put it right back in February, I promise. The silence in the dining room stretched tight. I looked at Chloe. She was biting her bottom lip, trying to look concerned, but her eyes were calculating, watching me like a hawk watching a field mouse. Then I looked at Bradley. I looked into the brown eyes of the boy I had sung to sleep, the boy whose college tuition I had paid by working overtime, the man who had forged my signature to bet on my death, the man who was currently lying to my face about a roof repair to cover his wife's maxed-out credit cards before their extravagant Christmas party. At that exact moment, the final, lingering shred of my maternal blindness evaporated. It simply ceased to exist. I wasn't looking at my son anymore. I was looking at a stranger. A dangerous, entitled stranger who believed I was nothing more than an ATM with a heartbeat. The psychological break was profound. The pain was gone. The grief was gone. All that was left was an icy, exhilarating clarity. I let the silence hang for 5 agonizing seconds. I watched the panic begin to flicker behind Bradley's eyes. And then I smiled. It wasn't my usual warm, accommodating grandmother smile. It was a smile that didn't reach my eyes. It was the smile of a predator granting its prey a head start. "Of course, Bradley," I said, my voice smooth as glass. "A roof repair is an emergency. We can't have the house falling apart. I will take care of the transfer." Bradley exhaled a massive, shuddering breath of relief. His shoulders dropped 3 inches. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Thank you, Mom. God, you don't know what a relief that is. You're amazing." "You're welcome," I said quietly, gently pulling my hand out from under his. I stood up, taking my plate to the kitchen. Behind me, I could hear Chloe whisper emphatically to Bradley, "I told you she would do it." I walked down the stairs to my basement room, the cheap purple scarf still draped over my arm. I threw it into the trash can next to my desk. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my laptop. I didn't log into the bank. I didn't transfer $5,000. The bank account he thought he was pulling from was already frozen, locked tight by the fraud department. Instead, I opened my email and composed a single one-line message to Margaret Vance. They took the bait. File the paperwork. Tomorrow was Thursday. In exactly 48 hours, Chloe's spectacular catered Christmas Eve party would begin. The house would be full of the affluent neighbors they were so desperate to impress. And in exactly 48 hours, the financial landmines I had planted all over their perfect plastic lives were going to detonate simultaneously. I turned off the bedside lamp, lay back on my thin mattress in the dark, and for the first time in 2 years, I slept through the night. Thursday morning broke with the kind of frantic, suffocating energy that only a suburban holiday party could generate. From the moment the sun crept over the frosted rooftops of Westchester, the house was a war zone of aesthetic perfection. Delivery trucks idled in the driveway, dropping off massive floral arrangements of winter white roses and silver eucalyptus. The caterers were scheduled to arrive on Friday morning to prep, but today was dedicated to transforming the house into a flawless, glittering stage. And as always, I was the invisible stagehand. I spent the morning polishing the antique silver platters Chloe had rented for the hors d'oeuvres. I stood at the deep porcelain sink, my hands dark with tarnish, methodically rubbing the soft cloth in tight circles. Every time a smudge disappeared, leaving behind a brilliant mirror-like shine, I thought of Margaret Vance sitting in her Manhattan office, methodically drafting the paperwork that would shatter this entire illusion. "Eleanor, please tell me you didn't use the abrasive sponge on those," Chloe snapped, marching into the kitchen. She was wearing a matching cashmere loungewear set, her phone glued to her ear, looking utterly exhausted and tightly wound. "Just the microfiber cloth and the silver cream, Chloe, exactly as you asked," I replied, my voice perfectly level. She didn't even look at me, already talking back into the phone. "No, the ice sculpture needs to be delivered by 3 p.m. Tomorrow, not 4. The lighting will be wrong by 4. Just fix it." She ended the call with an irritated sigh and massaged her temples. "This party is going to put me in an early grave." Oh, the irony, I thought, setting the gleaming platter on a drying towel. "Is there anything else you need me to do upstairs?" I asked, wiping my hands. "Just make sure the guest bathroom is immaculate. The cleaning service missed a spot on the baseboards yesterday, and Susan from the PTA is notoriously judgmental. I have to go pick up my dress from the tailor." She grabbed her keys from the marble island. "And please, if the florist comes back with the extra garlands, tell them to leave them on the porch. Don't try to hang them yourself. You'll just get tired and we don't have time for a hospital run." With that casual, condescending dismissal, she was gone, the heavy front door slamming shut behind her. The house fell silent. I didn't go to the guest bathroom. I went straight down to my basement room, locked the door, and opened my laptop. It was time to sever the arteries. For the past year, Chloe had been walking around with a platinum credit card in her designer wallet. It had her name on it, but the account belonged to me. When Bradley had first claimed they were restructuring their debt, he had asked me to add Chloe as an authorized user to my oldest, highest limit account, supposedly just to help boost her credit score. I had agreed, with the strict stipulation that it was never to be used. But as I logged into the American Express portal, the truth of their restructuring was laid bare. The balance was hovering just below the $30,000 limit. She had been using it for months. Small things at first, lunches, coffee runs, an online boutique here and there. But in the last 3 weeks, as their own cards maxed out, my account had become her primary lifeline. The pending charges from just the last 48 hours were staggering. $800 at a high-end liquor store, $1,200 at a boutique butcher for the party's charcuterie, and $400 to a luxury event rental company. My finger hovered over the trackpad. My heart beat a steady, calm rhythm against my ribs. There was no hesitation left in me. I clicked on Account Management. I clicked on Authorized Users. I found Chloe Hayes, and I clicked Remove User and Deactivate Card. A prompt popped up, warning me that the secondary card would be immediately declined for any future transactions. I confirmed the action. Just like that, the financial umbilical cord was cut. I sat back in my chair, exhaling a long, slow breath. The pending charges would still hit my account, a final bitter pill I would have to swallow to maintain my cover. But any outstanding balances for the party vendors that hadn't been swiped yet? Those were going to bounce hard. Tomorrow night, in front of 75 of her closest, most judgmental friends, Chloe Hayes was going to run out of runway. I closed the laptop and headed upstairs. I still had a role to play. I spent the next 2 hours thoroughly cleaning the living room, exactly as I was expected to. I fluffed the velvet throw pillows, vacuumed the Persian rug, and dusted the massive stone fireplace. But as I moved around the room, I placed something small and discreet on the bookshelf, tucked neatly behind a framed family photograph. It was an old digital voice recorder. My husband used to use it to dictate notes when he was managing the hardware store back in Ohio. It was small, black, and completely unnoticeable in the shadows of the shelf. I pressed the record button, the tiny red light blinking to life before I angled it out of sight. I had learned my lesson in the laundry room. I was no longer going to rely on accidental eavesdropping. In a war, intelligence is everything, and my son and his wife were notoriously careless when they thought they were alone. I went back down to the basement and waited. Chloe returned an hour later. I heard the sharp click of her heels on the hardwood floor above me. She paced back and forth in the living room, her voice carrying faintly through the floorboards. She was on the phone. I couldn't make out the words from my room, but the tone was urgent, hushed, and intense. She stayed on the line for nearly 45 minutes before I heard Bradley's car pull into the garage. They spoke briefly upstairs, the low rumble of his voice mingling with the sharp edges of hers, before they both retreated to the kitchen to deal with another vendor delivery. It was my window. I slipped silently up the stairs, my stocking feet making no sound on the wood. The living room was empty. I reached behind the silver picture frame, my fingers brushing the cool plastic of the recorder. I slipped it into the pocket of my cardigan and vanished back into the basement before either of them knew I was there. I sat on the edge of my narrow bed, the air in the room feeling suddenly heavy. I plugged a cheap pair of wired earbuds into the recorder and pressed play. First, there was just the sound of my own footsteps retreating, then the distant hum of the vacuum cleaner I'd been using earlier. I fast-forwarded until I heard the distinct sound of the front door opening and Chloe's heels clicking into the room. There was a pause, the sound of her dialing, and then she spoke. "Yes, hello. I'm calling back regarding the admission application for Eleanor Hayes. I spoke with a representative yesterday." The blood in my veins turned to ice. I stopped breathing. "Admission application?" "Yes, the facility in Mount Vernon," Chloe's recorded voice continued, sounding perfectly professional. laced with a terrifyingly fake layer of sorrow. I know there's a wait list, but I was hoping we could expedite the process. The situation at home has become untenable. There was a pause as the person on the other end spoke. I gripped the recorder so tightly my knuckles turned stark white. Mount Vernon. That was a state-funded facility, a warehouse for the forgotten elderly. It was notorious in the county for severe understaffing and miserable conditions. It was where families sent people when they had absolutely no money left. I understand it requires a medical evaluation, Chloe said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. But her cognitive decline has been rapid. She's wandering the house at night, leaving the stove on, forgetting where she is. My husband and I are terrified she's going to hurt our children. It's early onset dementia, we're sure of it. We just cannot provide the level of 24-hour care she requires anymore. A wave of nausea washed over me, so violent I had to double over, resting my forehead against my knees. They weren't just waiting for me to die. They weren't just praying for an accident so they could collect a fraudulent insurance payout. They were actively plotting to have me declared legally incompetent. I listened, paralyzed, as Chloe continued outlining her grotesque fiction to the admissions coordinator. She detailed fabricated incidents of my supposed madness. She spun a tragic tale of a dutiful daughter-in-law at the end of her rope. Financially? Well, she has a very modest pension, which we can sign over to the facility to cover the state minimums. And her assets? Well, her name is on the deed to our house. But once she is declared medically unfit, my husband has the power of attorney paperwork drawn up to assume full control of her estate. We need to get her placed immediately after the holidays, January 2nd, if possible. I pressed pause. The silence in my basement room rang in my ears. If they had me declared incompetent, if they managed to get a doctor to sign off on Chloe's lies, Bradley would use that fraudulent power of attorney to seize my 40% equity in the house. He would use my own money to pay off his debts, and I would spend the rest of my days drugged and restrained in a bleak, linoleum-floored room, staring at a wall, completely erased from the world. They hadn't just stolen my money. They were trying to steal my mind, my freedom, my very existence. I pulled the earbuds out. The nausea was gone. The lingering, pathetic hope that maybe, deep down, my son still loved me was entirely incinerated. I was no longer a mother dealing with a wayward child. I was a woman fighting for her life against two predators who happened to share my address. I picked up my phone and dialed Margaret Vance. She answered on the second ring. "Margaret," they said. My voice didn't crack. It didn't tremble. It sounded like steel striking flint. "We have a change of plans." "What happened?" The lawyer in her instantly snapped to attention. "I just intercepted a phone call. Chloe is trying to have me committed to a state-funded nursing home for dementia. They are planning to use a forged power of attorney to seize my equity the moment I'm locked up. They want me gone by January 2nd. Margaret swore softly, a sharp, vicious word that echoed my own internal rage. "That is a whole new level of depravity. Eleanor, you need to pack a bag. You cannot stay in that house. If they call Adult Protective Services and put on a good enough show, it could take me weeks to untangle the mess and get you out." "I am not running, Margaret," I said, my voice eerily calm. "I am not sneaking out the back door like a frightened animal. I paid for this house. I own it. And I am going to watch them lose it." "Eleanor, it's risky." "I have a voice recording of her admitting to the fabrication," I interrupted. "It's illegal in this state to record without consent, I know. It won't hold up in court. But I don't need it for court. I need it for leverage." I took a deep breath, staring at the concrete wall of my basement cell. "I want you to file the partition lawsuit. First thing tomorrow morning. I want the lis pendens slapped on the title before the banks open. But do not serve him the papers at his office." "Where do you want him served?" Margaret asked, catching the dark drift of my plan. "Tomorrow is Christmas Eve," I said, looking up at the ceiling where the faint sound of Chloe organizing the dining room drifted down. "Chloe is hosting the social event of the season. 75 guests. All of Bradley's partners from the firm, all of her influencer friends. Everyone they have spent my money trying to impress." I smiled, a cold, hard pulling of the lips that held no joy. "I want the process server to walk right through her custom-made front doors in the middle of the cocktail hour. I want him served in front of everyone. I want the blast radius to be absolute." Margaret was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice held a note of profound, terrifying respect. "Consider it done, Eleanor. I'll hire the most obnoxious, persistent process server in Manhattan. He'll have a red bow on the envelope. Thank you, Margaret." I hung up the phone. I stood up, walked over to the small, cheap dresser, and pulled out my largest suitcase. I laid it open on the bed. I didn't pack in a panic. I packed with meticulous, joyful precision. I folded the thick wool sweaters my husband had bought me. I packed my jewelry, my documents, the few photographs that truly mattered. I left behind the cheap purple scarf Bradley had given me. I left behind the cardigans Chloe hated. I packed away the ghost and left nothing but the armor. By the time the sun set on Thursday evening, my bags were packed and hidden under the bed. The financial traps were set. The legal strike was authorized. The match had been struck, and it was currently plummeting in slow motion toward a sea of gasoline. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve, the season of giving, and I was about to give my son exactly what he deserved. Christmas Eve arrived with a sky the color of bruised iron, threatening snow. But inside the Westchester house, you would never know it was a cold, unforgiving world. Chloe had transformed the sprawling first floor into a glittering, over-the-top winter wonderland designed entirely for the camera. By 7 o'clock that evening, the house was packed. 75 of the most influential, affluent people in their social circle had arrived. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cedarwood perfume, roasted lamb from the catering staff, and the sharp, bright clinking of crystal champagne flutes. A hired jazz trio played softly in the corner of the living room. Chloe, wearing a stunning floor-length crimson silk gown, was weaving through the crowd with her phone mounted on a gimbal, live-streaming the perfection of her life to her thousands of followers. Bradley was holding court near the fireplace, a glass of 20-year-old scotch in his hand, laughing loudly with the senior partners from his law firm. I was instructed to wear a neutral beige cardigan and to mingle quietly near the back of the room. I was the prop grandmother, the aesthetic accessory to prove they were a wholesome, loving family. I stood near the heavy oak staircase, holding a glass of sparkling water, watching the performance. I felt no anger. I felt no sorrow. I felt like a watchmaker observing a highly complex, deeply flawed clock just seconds before the gears completely shattered. The first crack in the porcelain facade happened at exactly 8:15. I saw the head caterer, a stern-faced man in a black suit, weave through the crowd and tap Chloe on the shoulder. Her dazzling, camera-ready smile faltered for a fraction of a second as he leaned in and whispered something in her ear. She instantly lowered her phone, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She grabbed Bradley by the sleeve, pulling him away from his partners and into the shadowy alcove near the kitchen pantry. I drifted closer, the noise of the jazz trio masking my footsteps. "What do you mean it declined?" Bradley was hissing, his face flushing a dark, mottled red. "I mean the terminal declined it, Brad," Chloe whispered fiercely, her perfectly manicured hands shaking. "The final $5,000 payment for the raw bar and the staff. It bounced. The caterer says if we don't provide a working card in the next 10 minutes, he is pulling his staff and taking the remaining food right out the back door." "Just use the Amex," Bradley snapped, running a hand through his carefully styled hair. "I did use the Amex." Chloe's voice cracked, bordering on a sob. "I used your mother's authorized card. It said account closed. Not declined. Closed." "Bradley, what did you do?" "I didn't do anything," he fired back, pure panic finally bleeding into his eyes. Right at that moment, the second domino fell. It wasn't a slow realization. It was sudden, absolute, and utterly blinding. The jazz trio's electric bass amplifier popped. The thousands of cascading white fairy lights adorning the banisters died. The massive crystal chandelier above the entryway blinked out. The entire sprawling house was plunged into pitch-black darkness. The music stopped abruptly. A collective gasp echoed from the 75 guests, followed by a wave of confused murmuring. "Bradley?" Chloe shrieked in the darkness, the pitch of her voice shattering the illusion of her perfectly curated life. The electric company. Bradley had been 3 months behind on the utility bills, floating the balance by setting up an automatic last-minute payment arrangement attached to my credit card. The card I had canceled 24 hours ago. The grace period had ended, the payment had bounced, and the automated system had cut the power. The only light in the house came from the wood-burning fireplace and the faint glow of the guests' cell phones as they pulled them out to illuminate the sudden chaos. "Everyone, Please, just a blown breaker, Bradley yelled into the dark, his voice tight and trembling with adrenaline. Just stay put, I'll get it fixed right away. He didn't make it to the basement panel. Before he could even take a step toward the stairs, a heavy, aggressive pounding echoed from the front door. It wasn't the polite, measured knock of a late-party guest. It was the loud, authoritative pounding of law enforcement or something much worse. Bradley, sweating profusely in his tailored suit, practically sprinted to the entryway. The guests near the foyer stepped back, holding their phone flashlights up, illuminating Bradley's pale face as he pulled the heavy door open. Standing on the porch was a man in a cheap, rumpled gray suit. He didn't look like he belonged in Westchester. He looked like he belonged in a gritty downtown precinct. And in his hand he held a thick manila envelope wrapped in a bright, festive red ribbon. "Bradley Hayes?" the man barked. His voice was loud, carrying easily over the hushed, confused whispers of the elite crowd. "Yes, but we have a situation here. You need to—" The man didn't let him finish. He shoved the heavy envelope directly into Bradley's chest. "You've been served," the process server announced cheerfully. "Merry Christmas." He turned on his heel and walked back down the dark driveway. Bradley stood frozen in the open doorway, the biting winter wind sweeping into the foyer. The beam of a dozen cell phone flashlights illuminated the red ribbon and the bold legal stamp on the envelope. Chloe pushed her way to the front, grabbing the envelope from his paralyzed hands. She tore off the ribbon and ripped it open. I didn't need to be close to see her face contort in absolute horror. I knew exactly what she was reading. Notice of pendency of action. Partition lawsuit. Eleanor Hayes versus Bradley Hayes. "What is this?" Chloe gasped, her voice echoing in the silent, dark house. "Bradley, what does force the sale mean? Why is your mother suing us?" The whispers of the partners, the influencers, and the neighbors erupted into a loud, scandalous buzz. The caterers, realizing they were never getting paid, began loudly packing up the silverware in the background. The facade was entirely, irreparably destroyed. The humiliation was absolute. I didn't stay to watch him try to explain. I had seen enough. I turned and walked quietly up the dark stairs. I went into my room, grabbed the handle of my large suitcase, and rolled it out into the hallway. Before I descended the back staircase that led to the garage, I walked over to the towering, dark Christmas tree in the corner of the living room. Underneath the mountain of lavishly wrapped empty boxes Chloe had placed there for aesthetics, I slid one small, plain brown box with Bradley's name written on it in black marker. I walked out the side door, into the biting, freezing air. My breath plumed in white clouds before me. 2 blocks down the street, sitting idling under a street lamp, was the black SUV I had ordered an hour ago. I opened the door, slid into the warm leather seat, and looked at the driver. "JFK Airport, please," I said. "Terminal 4. As the SUV pulled away, I looked back at the house one last time. It was a massive, dark tomb sitting on a perfectly manicured lawn. I didn't feel a single ounce of regret. I had paid for that house, and now I was leaving it to collapse on the people who tried to bury me inside it. I spent Christmas morning sitting in a plush leather chair in the Air France first-class lounge, sipping a mimosa and watching the sun rise over the tarmac. My phone had been ringing incessantly since 3 a.m. Dozens of missed calls from Bradley. Frantic, enraged text messages from Chloe. I didn't read them. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what was happening back in New York. I imagined Bradley waking up in a freezing house, the guests long gone, the caterers having stripped the kitchen bare. I imagined him finally opening the plain brown box I had left under the tree. Inside that box, he would find no hateful letters, no tearful goodbyes. He would find only photocopies. A photocopy of the forged $500,000 life insurance policy he took out on my life. A photocopy of the drained Fidelity bank statements. A photocopy of the Mount Vernon nursing home brochure I had found in Chloe's office. And a single handwritten sticky note attached to the top. "I am not your victim. I am your eviction notice. Check your father's trust." That was Margaret's brilliant final twist. The killing blow. When my husband died, he had left a secondary, smaller inheritance account that Bradley had never managed to get his hands on because it required my signature to unlock. It was meant to be passed down to Bradley eventually. But yesterday, before I boarded my flight, I had signed the paperwork to irrevocably transfer every single cent of that money into a generation-skipping trust. The sole beneficiaries were my 2 grandchildren. The money was locked away until their 25th birthdays, and I had appointed Margaret Vance's law firm as the absolute, immovable executors. Bradley and Chloe couldn't touch a dime of it, not even for educational purposes. They were completely, legally, and financially cut out of the bloodline. With the partition lawsuit filed, all of Bradley's assets tied to the house were frozen. He couldn't borrow against it. He couldn't refinance. The court would force the property to public auction within months. The bank would take their share to cover his massive debts. I would take my 40% right off the top, and Bradley and Chloe would be left with nothing but the clothes in their closets and a mountain of maxed-out credit cards. They had tried to take my life, my money, and my sanity. In return, I took the one thing they actually cared about, their aesthetic. Flight 014 to Paris Charles de Gaulle is now boarding, the polished voice over the intercom announced. I stood up, adjusting the strap of my purse. I left my phone on the small table in the lounge. I didn't turn it off. I just left it there, ringing into the void, a piece of plastic tying me to a life I no longer inhabited. I didn't need it where I was going. 3 weeks later, I was sitting at a tiny wrought iron table outside a cafe in the 4th arrondissement of Paris. The winter air was crisp, but the sun was remarkably bright, warming the cobblestones of the street. I was wearing a thick, luxurious cream-colored wool coat and a vibrant silk scarf I had bought from a boutique near the Seine. I took a sip of my café au lait, tearing off a piece of a warm, buttery croissant. I had bought a new phone. The only person who had the number was Margaret. She had called me 2 days ago to give me an update. Bradley's law firm, embarrassed by the public serving of the lawsuit at a party attended by their senior partners, had quietly asked him to take a leave of absence. Chloe's influencer channel had gone dark after rumors of their bankruptcy leaked into their social circle. The house was officially listed for a forced short sale. They were ruined. But sitting there, listening to the melodic chatter of French being spoken around me, I realized I rarely thought about them anymore. The anger that had fueled my escape had evaporated, leaving behind something much more profound: peace. A waiter walked by, smiling politely and nodding at me. "Bonjour, madame." "Bonjour," I replied, smiling back. And it was a real smile. It reached my eyes. I am 62 years old. My name is Eleanor. I used to be a ghost haunting the basement of a house I bought for people who hated me. But as I looked out at the timeless, sprawling beauty of Paris, feeling the sun on my face and the absolute, unshakable weight of my own freedom, I realized the truth. I didn't just survive my family, I outlived them, and my life was just beginning.